My name is Celeste Rains. I'm 31 years old, and I live in a two-bedroom, two-bathroom condo in the Miller neighborhood of Austin, Texas. The unit faces east. In the mornings, the light comes in wide and gold through the main room windows and turns everything it touches warm. The hardwood floors, the white walls, the walnut writing desk that sits in the second bedroom where I grade papers and keep my books. There's a small hook by the front door where I hang my keys every night when I come in. On that hook, right beside the brass condo key and the parking fob for spot 14B in the garage, there's a tiny enamel hummingbird keychain no bigger than my thumbnail. I paid $5 for it at the San Marcos Craft Market on a Saturday morning 3.5 years ago. I think about that keychain often. I think about what it cost me to find it. I think about what it gave back. Before we get into this, please like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now let me take you back. I grew up in a house on Mulberry Creek Drive in San Antonio, a 4-bedroom colonial with a stamped concrete driveway and a pair of crepe myrtles flanking the front walk that my mother kept pruned into submission every spring. She was a real estate agent at Keller Williams, my mother. Diane Rains, née Carpenter, 58 years old, a woman who understood that words were the architecture of perception long before I understood anything at all. And the house was always charming to the people she wanted to impress and modest to the people she wanted to seem grounded to. I learned to translate between the two versions before I started middle school. My father, Gordon, sold food service supplies for Cisco Foods out of a company car and a company polo, and the same 3 jokes he told at every gathering for 20 years running. He was a good man, kind in the easy, unexamined way that some men are kind when life has not required anything more complicated of them. He loved us. He just didn't always look directly at us. My sister Amber was 3 years older and had been performing the role of Diane Rains's ideal daughter since before I arrived to complicate the narrative. She was honey blonde and hazel-eyed and 5'7", and she drew teachers' attention without appearing to try. By 14, she was in AP courses. By 17, she was being recruited by UT Austin, Texas A&M, and SMU. My parents talked about her at every dinner party, every Thanksgiving, every church potluck where they ran into anyone from the neighborhood. Amber this, Amber that. Amber's scores, Amber's scholarship, Amber's future. It was not malicious. That is the honest, complicated thing about it. It was not malicious. It was just that Amber had arrived first and had fit the frame they'd built in their minds. And by the time I came along, the frame was already hung and there was no wall space left. I was dark-haired and quiet and good at things nobody threw a party for. I read rooms faster than anyone I knew. I remembered the details that mattered. The way a person's face changed when you touched a nerve, and the specific texture of a silence that meant something was wrong. I was a careful, steady student, the kind whose teachers wrote kind things in their remarks, but whose parents forgot to mention at the dinner table. I wanted to go to UT Austin's College of Education. I wanted to be a teacher. When I said that out loud for the first time, at 16, sitting at our kitchen table on a Tuesday night in October, my mother said, "That's sweet, honey," in the same tone she used when I showed her a finger painting in the 2nd grade. Amber got into Macomb's School of Business on a partial scholarship. My parents paid the gap without flinching. Tuition, a dorm meal plan, housing, and a second-hand Audi they presented at Thanksgiving with a bow on the hood, while Amber cried happy tears. I was sitting across the table watching that moment and thinking, I am going to UT too. I have already been accepted. I made a 3.9. I got a scholarship from the College of Education. Nobody put a bow on anything for me. I got a hug and a greeting card with a $20 bill folded inside. I borrowed $38,000 in federal student loans and I paid for the rest myself. I do not tell you this to make my parents into villains. I tell you this because the architecture of a family's love is built long before anyone has words for it, and by the time you have the words, the structure is already load-bearing. You don't knock down a load-bearing wall without planning very carefully for what holds the ceiling up after. My Aunt Vera was my father's older sister by 6 years. She had never married, had no biological children, and had spent 30 years running an interior design firm called Rains Plus Co. out of Alamo Heights, the kind of San Antonio neighborhood where the sidewalks are lined with live oaks and the bougainvillea is never out of control. She had started the business with a drafting table, a portable phone, and a reputation built entirely on word of mouth. By the time I was in high school, she had 4 employees and a waiting list that ran 3 months out. My mother found Vera exhausting in a way she never quite articulated. She called her unconventional, which was Diane's polished word for a woman she couldn't categorize and therefore couldn't trust. Vera wore her silver hair long. She drove a 1998 Saab that she refused on principle to replace. She read first editions and had actual opinions about them, not the kind you perform at book clubs, but the kind that come from reading alone at night and arguing with the text. She once took me to the McNay Art Museum when I was 11 and stood in front of a Bonnard painting for so long I thought something was wrong, and when I asked her what she was looking at, she said, "I'm trying to see what he saw before he decided what to paint." She was different from everyone else in my family. She was different from most adults I had encountered, period. When I was 9 years old, I was sitting at her kitchen table in Alamo Heights, eating tamales she had made herself, corn husks spread on the counter, masa on her hands, the smell of chile and pork and wood smoke threading through the whole small house. And she said to me, out of no particular context, "The most important thing you'll ever learn, is Celeste, is how to tell the difference between what something costs and what it's worth." She said it the way people say things they have arrived at through actual experience, not rehearsal. I didn't know what she meant. I stored it anyway, the way you store something your body recognizes, even when your mind doesn't yet have the drawer for it. What Vera and I had was specific and consistent. It started in childhood and grew through my 20s without either of us engineering it. She was the only adult in my early life who asked me questions that had no correct answer, not about grades or college plans or what I wanted to be when I grew up, but about what I was reading, what I thought about things, what made me genuinely laugh. When I was 15 and going through a stretch of invisible misery I didn't have the language to name, she drove to our house on a Saturday, took me to a taco place on Broadway near the Pearl, and said over black coffee, "You're doing better than you think. I can see it." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I loved her for that. Not the obligatory way you love family, the way you love people who choose to see you when seeing you costs them nothing and they do it anyway. Now I have to tell you about the birthday. Vera turned 65 in March, 3 years ago. My mother had organized a party at Paloma Blanca in Alamo Heights, the kind of restaurant where the chips come in a cloth-lined basket and the check makes your eyes move across the numbers twice. There were 14 of us around the table. Immediate family, a few of Vera's old clients who had become actual friends, my father's college roommate Paul and his wife Renee from Houston. The gift table was substantial. Amber and her husband Trevor. They had gotten married 2 years earlier at a Fredericksburg vineyard for $34,000, a number I knew because Diane had mentioned it 11 times. Had brought a large Waterford crystal vase, the kind you could only describe as a statement. My parents gave Vera a printed itinerary for a 3-night stay at a spa resort outside Bourne, fully prepaid. Vera's longtime client-turned-friend Patricia Mendez brought a silk scarf from a boutique on the Riverwalk. I saw Amber assess the scarf from across the table, her eyes doing the quiet calculation they always did. I had brought a brown paper bag with tissue paper inside, The context matters, and I want to be precise about it. I was 28 years old. I was in my third year teaching fourth grade at Barton Hills Elementary School on Barton Hills Drive. My salary was $47,200 a year before taxes. I paid $412 a month on my student loans. I paid $1,175 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in East Austin. I had a car payment of $289. My checking account the month of that party had $634 in it, before rent came out at the end of the week. I was not in crisis. I had enough always. But there was no cushion. There was no float. Every dollar I had was already assigned somewhere. So when Vera's birthday came in March, I did what I could do with what I had. The first Saturday of the month, I drove 40 minutes south on I-35 to the San Marcos Craft Market, because I knew a woman there named Dolores Vasquez who had a booth on the east side of the main pavilion, who made hand-painted enamel keychains. I had bought one for myself the previous spring, a small blue bird I kept on my keyring. But what brought me 40 minutes south on a Saturday instead of ordering something off Amazon was this. Years earlier, Vera had told me that her mother, my grandmother Ruby, who died of ovarian cancer when I was 12, had loved hummingbirds. Ruby had a hummingbird feeder outside every kitchen window she ever had. Vera said that whenever she saw a hummingbird, that flash of red and green that appeared and hovered and vanished before you could fully register it was real, she thought of her mother, that Ruby was close. Dolores had a hummingbird keychain, small, enamel, painted in red and green with a thin line of gold around the beak and a single iridescent dot at the throat. $5. Dolores wrapped it in a square of tissue paper and pressed a small flower sticker on the fold. I wrote a card. I want to tell you exactly what I wrote because it is the whole point of everything that comes after. I wrote, Aunt Vera, you once told me that Ruby loved hummingbirds, that every time you see one, she's close. I hope every time you open your front door you feel that. I hope she's always close. Happy birthday. Love, Celeste. At the restaurant, when the gifts were opened, I watched my mother's face when Vera pulled the tissue paper apart and held up the keychain. I have spent years looking for a fair word for the expression that crossed Diane Raines's face in that moment. The most accurate word I can find is mortification, thinly glazed with pity. Amber laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly. She was never overtly cruel. She was too smart for that. But a short exhale of disbelief that she didn't quite muffle. She leaned toward Trevor and said something I only half caught. The tail end of it was, $5 maybe. Trevor looked at the tablecloth. My father didn't react at all, which was its own kind of reaction. Vera read the card. Then she read it a second time, and I watched her eyes track slowly across the words, and I watched something real and quiet happen behind them. Not performance, not social grace, something actual. She folded the card carefully, with intention, the way you fold something you mean to keep. And she looked up at me across the table. She said, Celeste. Just my name. Then, this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. My mother made a sound. Barely. More the ghost of a sound. A punctuation mark of disbelief she couldn't fully suppress. Amber's smile went still and polite. Patricia Mendez looked genuinely moved and nodded once. Vera unclasped her keyring right there at the table, in front of all of us, and threaded the hummingbird keychain on beside her car key and her house key. She held it up for a second in the candlelight, the tiny painted bird catching the flame, and then closed her hand around her keys and set them in her purse. I drove back to Austin that night with $629 in my checking account and a feeling I couldn't quite name. Something between dignity and grief. Something that happens when you are seen and the seeing is witnessed by the very people who made you doubt you were worth seeing. That was 3 years ago. In the 2 years that followed, Vera and I talked every Sunday. Not always for long, 20 minutes, sometimes 30, sometimes an hour if we were both in the right mood. But every week, through the kind of regularity that stops being a habit and becomes its own form of love. She asked about my students by name because I had told her their names and she had written them down. She asked about Marcus, my boyfriend, Marcus Webb, 33, UX designer at Dell Technologies, the most consistently steady person I have ever loved. And she tracked the details I gave her, asked follow-up questions, treated my life as something worth keeping track of. She never talked about money. Vera was not a person who talked about money in the way my parents talked about it, as a measure of someone's value or a predictor of their future. She talked about what things were for. I knew she had done well. Rains Plus Company had been profitable for 3 decades. She owned her Alamo Heights townhome outright. She had no debt I knew of, but the idea of significant wealth attached to her name had always felt abstract to me, something that lived in the background of other people's calculations and had never been part of mine. She drove a 26-year-old Saab. She bought her furniture at estate sales and restored it herself. Her kitchen was the same one it had been when I was 9 years old, the same white tile and wooden handles and that particular smell of coffee and cedar and old books. My parents, and, in the last few years, Amber, had a different relationship to the idea of Vera's money. My mother had a careful, ongoing awareness of it. Vera had never made her will known, as far as anyone in the family understood. My father, was her only living sibling, and Amber had, in the 2 years before Vera's 65th birthday, begun calling her more regularly. Every 2 weeks, roughly, invitations to wine weekends in Fredericksburg, thoughtful gifts at Christmas, a sudden warmth and attentiveness that had not existed before. I noticed it. I noticed the correlation between the frequency of contact and Vera's increasing age, and I felt something I can only describe as a low, tired sadness. Not for myself, but for Vera, for the quiet indignity of being courted by people counting your years like a countdown. Vera noticed it too. We were on the phone in October of the year after the birthday, a Sunday afternoon, and she said, very quietly, the way she said the things that mattered, "Your sister calls me now, every 2 weeks, almost to the day." A pause. I wonder what changed. I didn't say anything. She said, "You never call because you want something, do you, Celeste?" I said, "I call because I want to talk to you." A pause. Then, "I know." That's what I said. In January of last year, Vera had a cardiac event. Not a heart attack. An arrhythmia, caught during a routine checkup at Methodist Hospital on Floyd Curl Drive, significant enough that her cardiologist, Dr. Emmett Tran, scheduled her for an ablation procedure the following month. She was not in danger, she told me on the phone. It was managed. It was being handled. She called me first, before she called my father. She called me, and she told me, and she said she needed me to hear it through the right version before the family version took shape. Then she called Gordon. The family mobilized the way families mobilize around a medical event, with concern that had, in varying degrees, other things threaded through it. My mother drove to Alamo Heights with a chicken and rice casserole and a brisk, warm efficiency that I believe was genuine at its core. Amber called every day for the first 2 weeks, asking detailed questions about the procedure, about recovery protocols, about whether Vera had updated her estate documents recently. That last question worked into the conversation so smoothly that I think Amber half believed she was being subtle. My father sat with Vera the morning of the ablation and held her hand, and I believe that was entirely, uncomplicatedly genuine. I drove down the Friday before the procedure and spent the weekend. We ordered pizza from Southerly. I organized her pantry on Saturday morning because it had been bothering her and she couldn't reach the upper shelves. We watched two movies she had been meaning to see for months. A French film about a retired architect that neither of us fully understood, and a documentary about a woman who had hand-restored a 1920s farmhouse in Vermont that we both loved completely. We did not talk about the procedure much. We talked about Marcus and about Darius, one of my students, 9 years old, who had started drawing elaborate comics in the margins of his math worksheets instead of doing the actual math, comics with continuing characters and backstory. And about a walnut writing desk Vera had found at an estate sale in Hilotes and restored herself, which was now in her study, and was the most beautiful piece of furniture I had seen in my life. Small and purposeful, and nothing at all like what it had cost her. The morning I left, Sunday, she was standing at her back door seeing me out. The hummingbird keychain was on her hook beside the door, right at eye level, the little painted bird catching the gray February light. She looked at me for a moment and said, "I've been thinking about things. The way you do when something makes you pay attention." A pause. "I want you to know I've taken care of it." I thought she meant the procedure, the medical logistics, the arrangements, the practical business of getting through it safely. I said, "I know. Dr. Tran seems excellent." She almost smiled. "That's not what I mean." I drove back to Austin. The procedure 2 weeks later was uncomplicated. By March, Vera was walking the McNay Gardens and going to her estate sale mornings and having her regular lunches with Patricia. I thought about that Sunday conversation occasionally, about what she had meant by taken care of it, and let it stay vague. It was not mine to push. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late April. I was at my kitchen table with leftover pad thai from the place on South Congress, and 24 reading comprehension worksheets spread in front of me, my fourth grader's assessments on the chapter book we had just finished. When my phone lit up with Vera's name, she said, "Are you free Saturday? I'd like you to come down." I said yes. I always said yes. Saturday was warm and cloudless, in the kind of Central Texas spring morning that makes you briefly forget what August will feel like. I drove I-35 south past the Buddha exits and the outlet malls, into the edge of the hill country where the cedar starts thickening and the sky opens up and gets bigger. Vera's neighborhood in Alamo Heights was quiet and settled in the way of places that have been lived in honestly. The trees had grown over the streets, the houses had a certain weight to them, a sense that things had happened here and been absorbed. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table I had been sitting at since I was 9 years old, and for a few minutes we talked about nothing consequential. A book she was reading, a particularly absurd thing one of my students had said that week. The light through her kitchen window was white and cool. And the hummingbird keychain was on the hook by the back door, exactly where it always was. Then Vera put both hands flat on the table, looked at me, and pushed an envelope across the surface toward me. Legal-sized, white, the return address printed in clean serif font, Swick and Flores, attorneys at law, 409 East Commerce Street, San Antonio, Texas 78205. I looked at her. She nodded once. I opened it. Inside was a set of documents fastened with a binder clip, several pages of formal legal language. But the top sheet was a cover letter from Harold Swick, and Harold Swick did not write in dense legal language. He wrote clearly. His summary was 4 sentences at the top of the page. I read those 4 sentences. I read them again. I read them a third time and felt the words arrange themselves in my understanding, like furniture being moved into the correct positions in a room that had always been meant for them. And then I sat very still. The property at 2204 Zach Scott Street, Unit 4, B, Muller Neighborhood, Austin, Texas, 78723. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1,340 square feet. Purchased by Vera Annette Rains in 2016 for $382,000 as an investment property. currently appraised at $760,000, tenanted continuously for 6 years. The most recent tenant had vacated in February, and the unit had been professionally cleaned and was now vacant. The deed had been transferred into the name of Celeste Margot Rains, effective April 12th, recorded with the Travis County Clerk's Office. No mortgage, no lien, no condition attached to the transfer, no repayment expected. And it was simply mine. I sat there for what felt like several minutes but was probably less than one. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could smell the coffee. Through the window behind Vera's head, I could see her back porch, and on the porch railing there was a glass hummingbird feeder with red ports, and there was a broad-tailed hummingbird working its way around it, hovering, gone, hovering again, the throat a flash of iridescent red in the morning light. I said, "Vera," she said, "you never asked for anything." I said, "I didn't do this to—" She said, "I know. That's the point, Celeste. That is exactly the point." My hands were shaking, not from fear, from the particular physical weight of something you didn't expect and didn't engineer and somehow already knew, in some quiet room of yourself you had never unlocked, that you deserved. I had felt this before, but smaller. In the restaurant in Alamo Heights at her 65th birthday, when she folded my card carefully and threaded the keychain onto her ring in front of everyone. I had felt it then, the clean, precise sensation of being truly seen, and I had not known I was feeling the beginning of something. She said, "The tenant left in February. I had it cleaned. There's nothing left to do." A pause. "The keys are in that envelope." I looked back at the envelope. There was a small interior pocket at the bottom I hadn't noticed. I reached in. 2 brass keys on a ring and a parking fob. I couldn't speak. Vera said, "I have enough. And I have more than enough. And I'm 67. And my heart reminded me in January that I should stop treating more time as a guarantee." She looked out toward the back porch, toward the feeder. "I want the rest of what I have to go to people who will actually feel it, not people who call every 2 weeks in case I'm writing it down." Her voice was even and dry, and there was something behind it that wasn't anger. It was cleaner than anger. It was clarity. "You are the only person in this family who has ever given me something that cost you something real. Not money, Celeste. Thought. Memory. The 20 years you had been storing the right detail about the right thing." She paused. $5 doesn't buy very much, but what you actually spent to find that keychain, the time, the drive, the intention, was worth more than anything your sister has offered me in 30 years. I started crying. Not planned, not theatrical. The involuntary consequence of a dam giving way quietly, the way water doesn't announce itself. It just moves. I cried the same way I cried alone, which meant I cried the same way I cried in front of Vera, because she had always been that safe. She didn't make a fuss of it. She put her hand over mine on the kitchen table and held it there and said, "You worked so hard, you did it so quietly. You deserve to have a home." I drove back to Austin that afternoon with the envelope in my passenger seat and my phone turned face down. I needed the drive to myself. I-35 northbound, the hill country giving way to the suburbs giving way to the Austin skyline, and the city spreading out against the April sky in its familiar low silhouette. I had driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times. It looked different now in the way that the same road looks different after something has permanently changed inside you. Not the road, just the eyes looking at it. I told Marcus when I got home. He was in the kitchen making dinner, pasta, a pot of tomato sauce on the back burner. And I sat down at our table, my rented table in my rented apartment, and I handed him the cover letter and watched him read it. He read it once, then again. He set it down carefully, the way you put down something fragile, and looked at me. He said, "Celeste." Just my name. the same way Vera had said it. I think the people who love you best are the ones who know when your name is the right complete sentence. I told my parents the following Sunday. I called them together. They were home. It was evening. And I told them that Vera had transferred a property to me, a condo in Austin, and that I was still absorbing it and had wanted them to hear it from me directly. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. Then my mother said, "What do you mean, transferred property?" I explained. "The address, the deed, the appraised value." A longer silence. My mother said, "I don't understand why she would do something like this without consulting the family." I said, "It's her property, Mom. It was hers to give." Diane said, "Gordon." I could hear her turning toward my father somewhere in the room. "Did you know about this?" My father made a sound of genuine confusion. He hadn't known. I could hear him trying to catch up in real time, in the way he always processed information. Slowly, methodically, without pretense. My mother said, "Celeste, a property at that value doesn't just— I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I think you should speak to a lawyer before—" I said, "I've already spoken to Harold Swick. The deed is recorded with Travis County. It's done, Mom." The silence that followed was a different silence. I had heard silences like it before. Not from my parents, but from the quality of a room right after something changes permanently, and everyone in it is deciding how to pretend to adjust. This was that silence. My father said, "Celeste, I think your mother just wants to be sure everyone understands the situation clearly." I said, "I understand it clearly, Dad." I got off the phone. Amber called 40 minutes later. I want to give Amber the complexity she deserves, because I meant what I said at the beginning. No one in this story is a cartoon. Amber had grown up in the same house I had, shaped by the same parents, and the damage that being the golden child does to a person is real and specific. When love is conditional on performance, you learn to perform at everything. When approval is a currency, you start spending it strategically. Amber was not purely calculating. She had moments of genuine warmth, times when the sister I had glimpsed in our childhood surfaced through the surface she had built over it. But she had also spent 34 years managing a set of expectations that had turned generosity into strategy and affection into leverage. And by the time she called me that Sunday night, she had already assembled a version of events in her mind that she believed, at least partially. She said, "I just got off the phone with Mom." I said, "I figured." She said, "Celeste." An edge under my name. $760,000. I said, "Yes." She said, "She never mentioned Austin property to any of us. She never talked about an investment condo, never said anything about—" A breath. "Did you know? Before today?" I said, "No." She said, "You expect me to believe that?" I said, "It's the truth, Amber. You were calling her every Sunday. You spent that whole weekend before her procedure. You were alone with her for 2 days before she went into surgery, and then 6 weeks later the deed gets—" She stopped. I could hear her working to keep her voice on the side of the line that felt more like genuine concern and less like what it actually was. "I just want to understand how this happened." I said, "She bought a property as an investment in 2016. Her tenant left in February. She decided to give it to me. That's the entire story." "And the rest of the family?" "It's her property, Amber." A pause. Trevor's voice in the background, low, asking something. She said, "She's 67 years old with a cardiac condition, and you were there the weekend before her ablation. Celeste, you have to understand how this looks." I felt something cold and very clear move through me. Not anger. Precision. I said, "I understand exactly how it looks to you. I also understand what it actually is." I paused. I gave her a $5 keychain at her 65th birthday because I couldn't afford anything else, and I wanted to give her something that meant something to her specifically. You gave her a $300 crystal vase because you wanted to make an impression on a table full of people. She put my keychain on her keyring and she kept it for 3 years. And then she transferred me a deed. That is the whole story. She was quiet for a long moment. I said, I'm not angry at you. I genuinely am not. But this conversation is finished. I hung up. The weeks that followed were complicated the way real life is complicated. Not cinematic, not resolving in a single cathartic confrontation, but layered and ongoing and requiring more sustained emotional attention than I had reserves for some days. My mother called 3 more times. And the first 2 were fishing expeditions, probing the legal mechanism, asking questions about whether the transfer could be revisited, whether there was any procedural avenue I might have missed. I answered the factual questions and nothing else. The third call was different. She was quieter. She said, I know I haven't always. And then she stopped. She started the sentence again. I know you and Vera were close, and I was dismissive of it. I never took it seriously as its own thing. I treated it like a consolation prize instead of understanding that it was another stop. She didn't finish that one either. My mother was not a woman who completed sentences that cost her. She was fluent in the language of implication and the half-said thing. But she had started this one. She had opened a door she had kept sealed for 31 years and stood at the threshold of it, and that was something. I said, I know, Mom. She said, I don't blame you. I'm struggling, but I don't blame you. I said, thank you for saying that. It wasn't a turning point. It wasn't the beginning of a new relationship, at least, not yet. It was a woman in her late 50s finding the precise edge of something true and letting me hear her standing at it. That was enough for where we were. My father called separately, a few days later, in the evening. He was quieter than I had ever heard him on the phone. He said, she never told me she had that condo. I didn't know. A pause. Vera always kept herself to herself. He said it without resentment, with something closer to admiration. I think she saw something in you that He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I said, I know you love me, Dad. He said, I should have been louder about it. I let that sit between us for a moment, long enough for it to mean something. Amber and I didn't speak for 3 months. In August, she sent me a text. Short. No preamble. Can we have lunch sometime? No agenda. I stared at it for a while. I said yes. She drove up from Dallas and we met at a restaurant at the Domain. A bright, open place with a patio and menu items we both spent more time reading than we needed to. We sat in a corner booth and talked carefully for 2 hours. She didn't apologize for the phone call. I didn't wait for one. We talked about her work at Frostbank, about Marcus, about a trip I was planning with Lena to New Orleans in October. And the conversation was deliberate and tender in the way that things are tender when they are still fragile and everyone knows it. But she laughed once, a real laugh, an unperformed one, at something I said about Darius and his continuing comics. And for that second she was just my sister. The one I remembered from when we were small. I don't know what we'll be to each other. That's the honest answer. 3 decades of a particular dynamic don't restructure over one lunch. But I'm not closed to finding out. My best friend Lena Okafor, 31, 4th grade teacher at Barton Hills, the best person I know outside of Marcus, cried when I told her. She was mid-sip at the Starbucks on South Lamar, and she put her cup down and cried loudly enough that the barista looked over, and then she grabbed my hand across the table and said, Celeste, do you understand that this happened because of who you are? Not luck, not timing, because of who you actually are. I didn't know how to hold that. I'm still learning. I moved into the Muller condo in June. Marcus helped me. 6 trips in his truck. 3 in my Honda Civic. the easiest move of my adult life, because I had been living with so little for so long. The unit was clean and empty except for a pair of wire shelves the previous tenant had left in the storage closet and a cracked terracotta pot on the back balcony that I filled with a rosemary plant from the Barton Creek Farmers Market on my first full weekend there. The apartment is full of morning light. The east-facing windows in the main room catch the sunrise and hold it, turning everything gold and warm until almost 9 when it softens to white. There are 2 bedrooms, the main one for Marcus and me, and the second one that I use as a workspace and reading room, where the walnut writing desk now sits. Vera gave it to me when she heard I was setting up the second room. She drove it up in a rented pickup herself, wouldn't hear of me arranging a delivery, and spent 20 minutes in the room, moving it an inch this way and then an inch back, until it sat in the light, the way she said it needed to. The neighborhood has a trail that runs along the perimeter of what was once a municipal airfield, wide, flat, edged with native grasses and the occasional cedar elm. I walk it before school most mornings while the air is still cool and the light is still low, and the day hasn't started requiring anything of me yet. I did the math once, carefully, in September. And what I had been paying in rent versus what I pay now. The figure was hard to sit with. Not from guilt, not from overwhelm, just from the strangeness of numbers rearranging themselves into a new picture of your life. I try not to do that math too often. It makes a specific kind of dizzy. Instead, I think about the Sunday morning in September when I called Vera and said, "I made breakfast on the balcony. The rosemary is doing well." And she said, "Tell me about the light." I told her about the light, the gold of it in the early morning, the way it moves through the east-facing windows like something living. She listened without interrupting for the entire description, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's how my mother described the kitchen in the first house she ever owned. The light in the morning, coming in from the east." We both sat with that. She said, "Ruby would have liked this very much." The hummingbird keychain is on the hook by my front door. It lives there alongside the brass key to Unit 4B and the parking fob for Spot 14B. The 3 of them on one ring. The little painted bird always the first thing my hand finds in the dark. Every morning when I leave for school, my fingers close around my keys and I feel the small enamel shape of it. The curve of the wing. The thin gold line along the beak. And I think about Dolores Vasquez at the San Marcos Craft Market. And the Saturday morning I drove 40 minutes south on I-35 because I wanted to give my aunt something true. I think about what Vera told me at her kitchen table when I was 9 years old. That the most important thing I would ever learn was the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. I thought at 9 that she was talking about furniture, about the professional eye she had trained across 30 years to find value where other people walked past it. I think now she was talking about people, about the ones in your life, and what you actually bring to them, and what that reveals about what you believe they deserve. I did not give Vera $5. I gave her the memory of her mother, held in a small painted hummingbird, and the knowledge that someone had been listening all those years, that someone had stored the right detail about the right thing and driven 40 minutes to find it on a Saturday when she couldn't afford anything else. That was what I gave her. She gave me a home. But that wasn't really what she gave me either. What she gave me, what she had been giving me since I was 9 years old eating tamales at her kitchen table in Alamo Heights, was the understanding that being seen is not luck. It is a covenant between the person who looks and the person who stays visible, even when everything around them is insisting they disappear. I am a 31-year-old fourth-grade teacher in Austin, Texas. I make $47,200 a year. I live in a 2-bedroom condo in the Mueller neighborhood that I own outright. I am paying down $38,000 in student loans and I will finish them before I am 35. I have Marcus, and I have Lena, and I have 24 fourth graders who don't know they're teaching me at least as much as I'm teaching them. Darius is now filling complete composition notebooks with his comics, continuing characters, actual plot lines, panels that are getting better every month. And his mother texted me in October to say he told her he wants to be an artist, and she wanted me to know that I had something to do with it. I have Vera, who turned 68 in March, and whose ablation is holding and who has started, slowly, teaching me what she knows about color and proportion and the way a room tells you what it needs if you stand still long enough to listen. And I have a front door, with a hook beside it, and a small enamel hummingbird on the hook, painted red and green with a thin line of gold at the beak, no bigger than my thumbnail. $5. Worth everything that came after. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, in the years of being the invisible one, in the small act of love that nobody applauded, in the long, quiet work of building something real when no one was watching, I want to hear from you. What would you have done? Leave it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, check the description.